Happy Friday, everyone. Hello and welcome. Welcome to Intentional Conversations. This is a vodcast that's brought to you by Nika White Consulting. I am Dr. Nika White and the founder and lead principal consultant for NWC. And we've been expecting each of you and super excited to hold space for this community of learners and also for you to get to meet our wonderful guest co-host today. I am super excited because not only today do we have a wonderful guest co-host, but I am able to be in community with one of my colleagues, Rachel Manurazzi, who serves as our Senior Director for Client Success, and she's going to be co-hosting with me today. And I really look forward to sharing space with her. As you join in and get settled into our vodcast community, I do encourage you all to use the chat for community. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. We always like to know where our audience is joining us from. And a big welcome to each of you. I also want you to be aware that at NWC, we do believe in disability justice. And so part of showing up for this broad community of diverse individuals, we like to make sure that we have the closed caption activated. So if you need that, know that it is there for your benefit. And we just appreciate you being a part of our community and our conversations today. I should also say Happy Women's History Month and specifically Happy Black Women's History Week. Really look forward to all that's being amplified during this month on behalf of women of all types, all intersectionalities, and I'm just excited that we have a chance to really value and celebrate women for all of the goodness that they bring to the world and our society. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I will share with you that cameras are not required, but they are certainly encouraged. We love smiling faces, but if you're participating today in just our auditory capacity, then we honor that as well and respect that. And we're just glad that you are here. So thank you so very much for being a part of our community. And so welcome to Intentional Conversations VodCast. Alrighty, so as we normally do, I like to just share a little bit of information for what you have to look forward to in the upcoming weeks with this Intentional Conversations podcast. So allow me just a moment to share those thoughts. First and foremost, you know that we've been celebrating our 5th anniversary, and so we're really super excited about that. It's not a small feat at all as a small business to reach 5 years, and so we are grateful for this community for helping to celebrate with us. Many of you have sent really great, kind sentiments and wishing us well, and we're so grateful for that. Also, I want to let you know that the reason we're able to do this week after week is because many of you are kind enough to extend to us your network. And so you often will provide recommendations of those that we need to have in our consideration set to invite as a co-host. And we want you to continue to send those recommendations. We ask that you please send us any names of those that you think we should have on our radar. And you can do so by emailing my colleague, Courtney@nikawhite.com. And we do very much appreciate your thoughts and recommendations in that regard. One of the ways in which we like to show up for the broad community in terms of helping people to deepen their understanding and their learning and awareness around topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging is by producing lots of content, one of which are short clips of videos that are called Inclusion Uncomplicated, Simplify DEI. And we release new content every week. And so we invite each of you to partake of that information by simply subscribing to our YouTube channel. And we hope that you will find it of value and maybe share it with someone else. As I also mentioned, it is Women's History Month, but I would be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge that it's also Black Women's History Week. And so we respect and honor the intersectionality of Blackness and womanhood, and certainly want to bring that to today's conversation. Now, in the weeks to come, we have some amazing guest co-hosts that we want to put on your radar so that you can prepare to join us by just simply registering as you have been. Next Friday, we have Jason Gant, and he is going to be talking about the correlation between mental health and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the importance of mindfulness and well-being. So he talks a lot about healthy masculinity and is such just a great human being in general that I can't wait for you to be in conversation with he and I next week as we host him on Intentional Conversations. And then the week following, we have a new Manda Petty, and we're going to be in that conversation looking at bias that arises in leadership and executive coaching engagements, also the well-being of CDOs, Chief Diversity Officers, and the use of teams to create a more inclusive organizational culture. So look forward to being in conversation with the new later this month. And then the last opportunity that I want to put on your radar that's coming up right across the corner will be Friday, March 24th. And my friend Vincent Pearson will be joining us. And in that vodcast, we're going to talk about the intersection of sports and social justice and how this relates to the work DEI practitioners are doing and the power of sports to impact society. We know that sports can be a huge unifier. And so I'm interested in seeing how he's connecting and intersecting the work of DEI in sports, and hope that you will join us on Friday, March 24th for that conversation. Now, last but certainly not least, you know how we do it here on the Intentional Conversations podcast. I want to give a formal introduction of our guest co-host today so that you know all of her accolades and all of her credentials and the lens in which she shows up to this work. And then we're going to have her to join us and then to greet this audience in her own way. And here is our guest co-host for today, Dr. Melissa Horne. Melissa received her PhD in modern U.S. and African American history from Rutgers University. She has worked both in Canada and the U.S., helping to make workplaces more diverse, inclusive, and equitable. At Dialectic, Melissa drives client experience, serving as the client champion on all projects. Melissa's passion is working to solve the most challenging problems facing your business. Her ability to develop a deep relationship-driven understanding of your core business is unparalleled, allowing Melissa to cover new insights and then relentlessly advocate for solutions that are actionable, measurable, and effective. We are eager to get this intentional conversation started and hope that you will help me in welcoming our guest co-host today, Dr. Melissa Horne, in your own way. Use the Zoom features, place some thoughts and sentiments into the chat, but let Melissa know that she is welcome here today, and we really appreciate her being here. Melissa, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. That's a wonderful welcome. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. We're so glad you're here. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that we like to do as we start out our Intentional Conversations podcast is to have our guest co-host to greet this audience. And specifically what we're looking for is, you can greet us in any way that feels comfortable, but we want to know, what do we not know about Melissa just by reading her bio? What else can you share with us that helps us to connect with you on a deeper level? So share with us, Melissa.
Yeah, so what wouldn't you know about me? I am a mother. I have a 10-year-old stepson, and I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, and a dog who I think I'm his service person. So he's very needy. But a bit more about me as well. So I've spent, I grew up here in Canada, but spent almost 10 years living and studying in the US. And I think that, well, I'll call it living abroad, but it really living abroad and living in a different country really, I think, has shaped me and how I view the world and how I think about not only myself in the world, but Canada in the world, and our relationship to other countries as well. So that's a bit about me, but I'm sure we can chat a bit more too.
No, absolutely. I want to bring my colleague Rachel in here, because the reason that you're here today, Melissa, is because of the relationship that you have with Rachel. And so Rachel, thank you so much for introducing us to Melissa, allowing us to be able to share her with this broader community. So Rachel, certainly greet this audience as well. Thank you for being here and for co-hosting with me today.
Hi, everyone. And hi, Melissa. So happy to have you here.
It's always great to have a conversation with you, Rachel.
Could you tell us more about where you went to school and why you chose the school you went to when you came to the US?
Yeah, so I often get asked, like, how did you, like, you're from Canada, like, how did you study Black history? Like, what led you to that? And it's kind of a funny story, but I I was signing up for my freshman year, a course in freshman year, and they were all out. And the only course available was a course on civil rights history. And the professor who taught it had actually gone to Rutgers and had studied under one of the sort of legends in the field of Black women's history in the US, Dr. Deborah Gray-White. And so as a young person who'd had, I think, a life that was fairly privileged, learning about folks who were willing to die for rights that I, took for granted on a daily basis was, I think it really moved me. And I became really interested in learning more about sort of the history of race and racism. And so that took me sort of down a path around, what does that look like? And I became really interested in sort of the history of student activism, not only because, I was moved by the students of the 50s and 60s, but as I started to look at sort of the history of race and racism in the US and the emergence of higher education for formerly enslaved peoples after the Civil War, I realized there was a much older history of student activism that had happened. And I was lucky enough that I was accepted at Rutgers, where they have one of the best Black history departments in the country to do that research and that work. And so, it was awesome. It was very fortunate.
So Melissa, we read in your bio the work that you do at a really high level, but I want you to unpack that a little bit deeper for us. Talk about maybe like the day in the life of the work that you do and how in which you support those individuals and organizations that find it appropriate to want to align and connect with you for your expertise.
Yeah, so at its core, our company is a custom e-learning business, but over the past few years, we have been working on a product called Learning Snippets. And the idea is that we realized that we were sort of part of this problem of where we were sort of doing these really limited engagements. People would come to us for unconscious bias training, and we do an in-person training, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And while in the moment, those trainings were really effective, people had these aha moments, there was this sort of gap into, so I'm more aware now, but what do I do? Okay, I understand I have an unconscious bias, but how do I, like, what does this look like in the workplace? How do I stop myself, or how do I get around that now that I'm aware, So what we did is we developed training that sort of takes you from sort of what these concepts are to how now to practice inclusive behaviors in the workplace. So moving sort of from, this awareness to action. Mm-hmm. And we found that we had done sort of the scenario-based training in other facets of our business. In other places, we would deliver sort of, these more in-person trainings and then allow people to practice the skills that we were working on. And much like, other leadership skills, inclusive behaviors are skills that we need to practice. We don't all necessarily know what to do when we see someone, when we see a microaggression happening, when someone's committing a microaggression, a colleague. We kind of all feel, we've had these feelings, right, where we're like, oh, this isn't right. But we don't always sort of have the language. We don't have the experience, and we're all often afraid of of saying and doing the wrong thing. And so with the learning snippets, we're modeling inclusive behaviors through these scenarios to allow people the opportunity to practice in a safe space, make mistakes, and then once they face these in the real world, they're better prepared.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to get my colleague Rachel in here to present the next question, but I do want to amplify what Rachel just amplified in the chat, which is your sentiments around inclusive behaviors are skills we need to practice. I don't think people realize that. It's almost like they feel like I need to either just automatically know how to be an inclusive-minded leader and let that show forth in practice, but we have to learn those skills and then practice those skills, hone those skills. And so I appreciate you bringing that to the conversation. Rachel?
So how can a business move more from awareness to action? I know learning snippets help with that. And how I understand learning snippets is it's like role playing. So how does learning snippets help a business move from awareness to action?
Yeah, so I think that, we're part of, I think, a larger, we play a small role in, I think, a company's larger efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion. Training is one part. You do need to sort of be aware. Like I don't want to say like we shouldn't learn about awareness, but we need to be aware of sort of the policies. I think there's a place for policy, culture, and training, and that helps to bring that all together. So we need to understand like where are the gaps in our policies, and sort of fix those. We need to sort of create those spaces, work on our company culture where we can have these conversations, because part of it as well is the work that leadership needs to do to ensure that folks, when, once they are practicing these skills, are practicing them in an environment that is safe and inclusive and is going to be receptive to that as well, right? So there's a lot of work that happens. And then when we move to action, then we're all practicing these behaviors that facilitate truly inclusive workplaces. So, I think about this as, I was thinking about this today before I joined, is that often people will say, well, I've done this training, so we're good. And it's like, well, but if you look at elite athletes, they don't just show up at the NBA and say, okay, I'm good, I don't need to practice anymore, I've learned everything I need to know, right? Mm-hmm. They're constantly honing and refining their skills. And this is the same with, I think, inclusive behaviors that we constantly have to practice and hone. And there's a myriad different ways that, that we can sort of, that we need to practice different skills. I mean, there's areas where I'm, I think I have my own blind spots. I have my own areas where I'm not as well-versed in the sort of, in the inclusion landscape, right? And so there's always ways that we can continue to practice. The other thing that when we do these learning snippets is that there's certain folks that we, certain identities that we may not have as much experience with. Right. And so a lot of this too, there's a sort of an empathy gap or understanding sort of the experiences of the people. But when we work through these different scenarios with people with different identities, we start to build empathy. A lot of people will say, well, I've never met a trans person. Mm-hmm. But, through our gender identity snippets, you meet folks who are non-binary, who are trans, and it sort of accelerates your empathy and your experience with folks with different identities as well.
Yeah, I love that you bring it.
And I think one of the things you said about the learning snippets is it allows people to learn alone, right? You can take the time to learn without people watching and observing you, so you're not so concerned that, am I making a mistake? Am I doing the right thing? Because you're sitting with your computer and you're going through the scenarios and you're practicing and you're figuring out, okay, maybe that was not the right thing to say. Perhaps I should have said this. And it's something you can do by yourself, right?
Yeah,
it is. Yeah. The other cool thing though, is that what we're finding though, is that people are sort of, as we're going through them, as people are going through them, they'll say, well, okay, I know what might be the right answer. And we think about this as sort of a good, better, best, because there's so many nuances and you have to sort of take into consideration a few things. But they might say, well, I know what sort of the best answer is. And then I also know like what our company would say is the best answer. And so, they start to see like, well, okay, how can we sort of use these snippets to sort of address maybe some of the gaps that we have in our company? Because if our company says, well, we should be doing this, but we kind of know that the more inclusive way would be to sort of follow this path, it starts to open up questions and ways of and dialogue amongst people as well. So we encourage folks to not only go through and be reflective on as they do the snippets themselves, but to also talk about it in the groups, because a lot of folks are surprised at sort of what the quote unquote right answer is. As well, right? And the idea is that there is sort of, as I said, there is no right or wrong answer. There are sort of good, better, best, and it's okay to sort of have gotten the wrong answer, because that's where the growth happens as well, and being able to talk about it, and then sort of knowing now, well, you don't know what you don't know, but now that you are able to sort of push forward in a different way as well.
Yeah, I think about the current state we're in as a society where I'm optimistic about us coming out of the pandemic, out of COVID. We're starting to see much more comfort with where we are right now. But I also believe that, and I place this into the chat, that some people are going to still maybe be they're going to favor more of those private learning opportunities, right? Because maybe there's this comfort in feeling like there's I don't have to be subject to guilting, shaming, and blaming. And that drives a lot of people away. It causes them to feel reticent about, participating in these learning experiences around topics of DEI. So I know that there's a comfort level that some people have. And I think that it's important, the same way that we talk about just diversity in the broad sense, it's important for us to also diversify the learning modalities that we are making available to people, because people receive and learn information in different ways. So I like that that's available. But I do want to talk a little bit about what are the implications of the pros and cons to the in-person training opportunities where you're in community with others and you can process what's coming up, your thinking. So just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I in no way sort of want to knock that. Like, I think there's tons of benefit. And we offer virtual training as well. The idea, though, is that what we're trying to do is use a couple things that we know about learning science. One, we're trying to overcome the forgetting curve. So, I think we've all been to some sort of training where we're so energized and it's like, this was awesome. I feel the energy, but and that feeling stays with you, but the content, your ability to remember the content fades, right? Or after an hour after you've already forgotten. I think there's a stat there around sort of how much we forget after an hour, and then it just continues to drop as we go off. So, so there's that. There is the feeling, and there is sort of I think it's really important to get folks together to have those moments where they can talk and they can share. And so those are those sort of awareness moments where it's like, okay, we all need to sort of understand, like, here are the key concepts, here are the key terms, here's how this operates. And I think in-person learning is a great place to do that, to have that community. And I think it's just really important when organizations make time and ask people to make time for these types of learning experiences as well, because I think it's really powerful. But what we do is that we're trying to overcome this forgetting curve by spacing out the learning so that we're taking small chunks of information. And we often work with other DI professionals and consultants, and they start off with their in-person training, and then they use the snippets to amplify and to reinforce what they covered. And so that's what we're doing. We're trying to, hit key things and practice some of the key components of other people's training as well. So that it's like, okay, I remember hearing this and this is what it looks like in action, right? We talked about how microaggressions can erode at a company's culture and morale, but what does that look like in place? And how do I, when I see a microaggression happening, or if I've witnessed it or heard about it, how do I approach it? And that's what we're trying to do, is say, okay, here, make those connections for folks. So I think it's really, really important that we still have these group sessions, because they're certainly powerful. So we're trying to get around the forgetting curve by spacing it out. And then obviously through the scenarios, by giving people the opportunity to practice what they would have heard in the in-person sessions, if they weren't already doing scenarios there. It's just another way to continue that training, that learning.
Right, good reinforcement. I love that. Rachel.
How we talked earlier on about your interest in African American history and what you learned in coming to America. How do you use history and activism and science to create a DEI training experience? How does that all fit in? Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think what's really interesting, and then that there is a rich history in both the US and Canada of activism and ways in which we've been able to affect change within systems. And so oftentimes we want to reinvent the wheel. We're thinking like we have to do something new, but there's actually really well proven methods to affect change. And so some of the things I like to think about is when I'm designing training and when I'm working with folks, is to sort of use moments in history to say, like, we've been here before. We need to, when we forget sort of the past, I think that can be problematic. But like, there's a few things I like to do. Is one, ordinary people have done amazing things. We may not know their names in the history books, but ordinary people have affected change. And so for companies, I like to think, you and your company, if you're advocating for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, you can affect a lot of change for your coworkers, for the people that you spend 8 hours of your day with, and that's important. And so I like to use sort of these different ways that activism looks like a bunch of different things. There are all the things that make the news, but there's small acts of resistance, the small acts of fighting for change that can make a huge difference in people's lives. So to me, there's a lot of lessons from history that we can take and to sort of empower people in their workplaces to advocate for change and to push forward. The other thing is that, there's lots of, as I mentioned before, the Learning Snippets draws on, the sort of the recent science around learning. And so we're always trying to ensure that as we're helping people to change their behaviors, that we're pulling from the science as well. And then, I think there's a few things that we need to think about in history is that it's important to sort of remember these things and to go back. And why I think it's so important to continue to practice these skills is that, there's many times where where change has happened, but we forget it, or we don't keep practicing, or we don't keep up with it. And, we come back and have to do it all over again. So it's really important. And this is why I think, I advocate for companies to truly invest in their DEI work in the way that they would in other professional development stuff, because, it's not enough, as I mentioned, just to get to the MBA. You have to keep practicing and honing your skills, because if you don't, you're going to, lapse back, and you're going to have to build that up again. So that's kind of how I bring sort of my background to the work that I do.
No, that's great. I love the science in this, Dr. Melissa. I love that you're bringing the science to this type of work. I think that it makes it even more effective. And you mentioned a couple of times to effect, the need of effecting change. And really just a comment here before I go to the next question, but sometimes there are organizations that we may encounter that believe the only way to affect change is through the learning and development, the exposing people, expanding their awareness so that then they can put it into practice. But I think it's a parallel path, and that seems like it's also a part of what you subscribe to as well. We need not only the training and the learning, but equally important, we need to make sure that we can actualize that learning to affect the change by implementing policies and procedures to help shift the systems, right? And I think that's such an important point that you have raised in this conversation. And then the other comment is repetition is necessary. It is a reinforcer. We have encountered at NWC a number of organizations that have called upon us for, development of these instructional design for DEI learning experiences. And they'll say, well, we don't want to address that topic because we've already brought someone in before, and we've already had a session on unconscious bias. And it gives us a chance to say, there's so much to unpack with that broad topic, right? Mm-hmm. And let's say that we even are addressing similar talking points and how in which we're delivering this information. The repetition behind it only helps to reinforce the need to keep practicing it, the need to keep it top of mind. And so I just want to encourage this broad audience that just because you've done a topic before, don't shy away from it. We need those reinforcements. And so those two comments I wanted to share. My next question is really about Melissa, and I welcome you to comment on those thoughts too. But my next question is about how important is it for those who are developing these learning experiences, whether it's online or even facilitating the work in in-person settings, to have lived experiences around the topics in which they are sharing. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to go back to just your first comment about, I really think it's important. I want to advocate that learning development is just one part of, I think, of a holistic approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I mean, I think about, in my own research, the students didn't just, they advocated for removing the white presidents and putting in Black presidents, changing the policies in the schools. And then there was a whole education and training piece around getting the broader community involved as well, right? So it's all these different structures. You need to have the policies, practices, and the people in place to ensure that your DI program is going to work. So it's not just a one or the other. It's all of these things that work in concert together. And then in terms of sort of the lived experience, absolutely. I think it's important, and when we're developing training. So when we've developed our learning snippets, obviously folks on our team have different lived experiences and identities. And so what we've done as we're developing our scenarios is to go out to both subject matter experts and to folks with lived experience to validate the scenarios as well, because there's only so much research one can do and so much, but unless you sort of have that lived experience, I think obviously there's a gap, right, in that. So for us, it's been very important when we write a snippet on accessibility that we talk to folks who are in wheelchairs. Is this how you would want, does this scenario feel real? If we're writing about a snippet on neurodiversity, we speak to neurodivergent folks to ensure that we're capturing the challenges. And for us, for my company, we partner with folks who are subject matter experts and folks with lived experience as well, because that just strengthens the work that we do. We're really good at developing e-learning, but there are folks out there who have lived experiences and who can, support work if we're talking about, gender identity, if we're talking about LGBTQ plus issues, if we're talking about anti-Black racism, we partner with folks because I think it's really powerful. And it also supports their businesses as well, which I think is really important, as well as supporting, and in this space, like supporting the folks who, who are doing the work as well, so.
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. I wanted to say to the audience, please share your questions in the chat, and we'll go to questions after this question. And Dr. Melissa, I wanted to pivot a little because
Absolutely.
When I first met you and we were speaking, one of the things that I say is that white supremacy is not just an issue we have in America. It's a worldwide issue. And I can say that coming from Zimbabwe because I experienced white supremacy in Africa. And when we were having a conversation, I mentioned to you that at least Canada is not as racist as America. That was my sentiment as a person who lives in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And so I would like for you to share with the audience a little bit, a high level, high level what we spoke about on that day when it came to my comment about at least there isn't racism in Canada. So yeah.
I think for many years, Canada, we promoted the idea that we were not the US, right? We have a national narrative that we were the place of the Underground Railroad. This is where, formerly enslaved people, came to free themselves. And so it's a wonderful narrative, but it's not true. And I think the murder of George Floyd sparked, similarly in the US, a sort of national reckoning here in Canada. It was a catalytic moment where where we realized that we have to confront anti-Black racism in Canada. And, this has been missing in our textbooks. As someone who spent decades studying or more studying Black history in the US, I was one of those people who was woefully ignorant of my own history here in Canada. And it really wasn't until partnering with other folks here in Canada that I learned about our country's history. So we had segregation. We had, and we still have white supremacist groups. It is very real in the workplace. It is very real in the curriculum. It is not as overt. It is, very much sort of woven within our systems, which almost make it, even more insidious because it's very hard. You have to really dig deep and rethink, how do we, yes, there we go. Rachel saying this is structural. Absolutely. We have definitely told ourselves a good story, but I think more and more we are learning that anti-Black racism is very real in Canada, and we have to address it. It's that rosy history that we've told ourselves is just simply not true. It is fabricated.
And it goes beyond, from what you shared with me, it goes beyond just the anti-Black racism. There was also what was done to the Indigenous people within Canada, right?
Yeah, we're also having a moment of reckoning around our colonial history, and looking at not just how colonialism operated in the past, but the way that colonialism operates in our current systems as well. So similarly, it's again structural. It's within our curriculum. It is very much in the way that our business practices operate. Again, it is sort of rampant throughout our country, but I think folks are beginning to sort of come face to face and look at how do we decolonize businesses? How do we decolonize these relationships? And what does this look like? We have to, I know that people start to think like, oh, this is hard, but it's like, no, this is it. This is the moment where we have an opportunity to really change and to start to dismantle these myths and these stories that we've told ourselves to forge a more equitable present and future.
Yeah, I want to stay right here before we shift to our audience questions, and not to get too far off of the broad topic that we're centering today around the effectiveness of DEI training. But as we're talking about anti-Blackness, racism, there are many that are of the persuasion that that is an issue that only exists here in the States, right? So we can, name a number of countries that I know we've been in conversations with clients that have a global presence that will often share those sentiments. And when we dig deep, we find it to be quite the contrary. It's almost like Canada had a good PR story, right? But here's really the truth. And we're seeing that play out right now, even as we think about the war on Ukraine. And there's these great sentiments around, we all need to stand in solidarity around the Ukrainians. And yes, absolutely we do. But some are of the persuasion that calling out the anti-Blackness racism that's occurring is maybe insensitive to what the Ukrainian people in general are dealing with. But again, so many of us that are in this space are saying there's a both and here. And we have to hold that middle, and we have to call them both out. And I just want to give you a chance to just share your thoughts and sentiments about what you're seeing and how this is applicable perhaps to this broader conversation that was started with Rachel's question of tell us about Canada and the racism that exists there or the lack thereof, and we've been able to really address that. So share with us, Melissa.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting. Canada actually has the largest Ukrainian population outside of the Ukraine and Russia. So definitely the events are hitting close to home, and I would agree. I've been on Twitter, and there's a lot of folks who are saying like, yes, we can stand with Ukraine, but we must stand against racism, and specifically anti-Black racism, and even just the way that the media is covering the story of refugees and the story of the even just the way that we think about of the war, right? And it's raising a lot of different questions around how wars in the Middle East are covered, how war on the African continent is covered, right? The way that we sort of, news folks are saying, well, they're using very xenophobic, very racialized rhetoric and language that glorifies, I guess, the struggle of Ukraine, which I don't want to minimize, but also then but it brings up tropes of Black and brown people as being sort of less than and less worthy of our support and our help. So I think we need to call this stuff out, because we need to hold the media accountable, we need to hold ourselves accountable, and we need to think about how we have in the past thought about war and refugees and who deserves our support, who's deserving of our support, and thinking about how we can hold space for two different ideas, right? It is okay, as you mentioned, to support the injustices and war against the Ukrainian people, but it is also okay to show how Black and brown students are being treated as they're trying to leave the country as well. And we also have to look at the fact that there is, Europe is experiencing a lot of white supremacy as well amongst their leadership. Like, this is just a fact and a reality. We need to address that as well. So,
yeah, I'm with you. So do we have any questions from the audience at this time? Michelle, I see your hand is up. Great, let's add you to the spotlight. Thanks for being here. Share your comments or your questions, please. You're muted right now.
I think that was the most popular comment that I said when I used to teach. You're on mute right now. You're on mute right now. So thank you for reminding me, and thank you always for having this fabulous show. You know, I had a few sentiments when you were talking. I'm a Canadian myself. I lived there for 35 years. And it's exactly what you said, very insidious and very, nothing spoken about. Everything is under the rug. So, going back to talking about, the Indigenous people, we have to remember that if, like you said, if it's not brought up in the media, if we don't hold ourselves accountable, we have to be able to change the narrative and bring it to light so that we know who the first Canadians were. Children were banned from using their Indigenous languages. Schools were unsanitary, children were malnourished, many faced neglect, physical abuse. Thousands died, but this is not the history that, that we've been told. And I think it's really important. And I'm happy, Dr. Melissa Horne, that you're here, and Dr. Nika White, that you're here just so we can talk about this, because it's something that's very, I can't even find the word. It's something that needs to be told.
Yeah.
We need to know and understand that this is what's been going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I was, I think in one of my conversations with Rachel, I shared that, when I was doing my research, people would say, "Oh, you're from Canada." Oh, okay, right. And I'm now that knowing better now, and I sort of traded on that. It's like, yeah, I am from Canada. We're not like the US, right? And because that national narrative is so powerful. It is, we have really embraced it. And now, 20 years later, I now say, yes, I am from Canada, but we have racism, we have problems, and this is what it looks like, right? And I think it's important to to acknowledge that, while this was something, that sort of, I guess, I benefited from, I refuse now to let that national narrative continue, and to let myself benefit from that as well, because we need to, this is why history is so important. We need to know our history, so that we don't repeat those same mistakes.
Dr. Melissa, I think when we spoke, you shared with me that they had just discovered bones of Indigenous children. Could you share that story with the audience?
Yeah. So for those who are joining from the US, there was a practice of residential schools in Canada, and that was where Indigenous children were taken from their homes to schools set up often through different religious denominations to strip their culture and their language from them. And what has been uncovered, what has been known for a while, but has been finally sort of brought, or the media paid attention to it finally, was the graves, the unmarked graves of many children who died while in the residential schools. And so we are currently sort of trying to reconcile what that means as a country. How do we you know, what does, we have a truth and reconciliation, we have truth and reconciliation here, and what does that actually look like to be, not just a document, but how do we live that? How do we as a country, how do we as individuals, how do we in business live truth and reconciliation? And so it is something that has been known about, but has finally just, I think, really captured the entire nation's interest in, and so I think, we've got lots of work to do.
Yeah, heartbreaking. So Sharon Long, who's a part of our community today, she placed a question into the chat that I want to amplify now. Thank you for your question, Sharon. How can we avoid stepping into explosive political conversations in a business setting or even educational school setting when we broach these topics and trainings?
It's interesting. So I was thinking about this, and it's an old feminist, like 1960s feminist term. The personal is political, and so there are, I think a lot of folks, their very identity is politicized, and so I think it's not necessarily, a lot of these topics have become politicized when they are very much not to be political, right? So, I think about right now, my heart aches for the trans kids in Texas, the parents of these trans kids who are trying to support their children and are now, facing prosecution, investigation around this. These are things that, people are bringing themselves to work, and we keep talking about bringing your whole self to work. And so if we try to ignore or look past or say, this is like where the color blindness comes into play. Like we see color, we see these things. We cannot minimize the way that people's identities impact how they are at work. And so we need to sort of confront that, people with caring responsibilities, that is part of their identity. We talk about that, right? Like people like moms, they talk about their kids at work. It doesn't feel like a political thing, but I'm saying, like, we bring ourselves to work. And if we truly say that we want a workplace that is inclusive, and that we talk, that where people feel like they belong, then we kind of have to confront these things, because people are bringing them to work, whether we see it or not. We often people say, like, we shouldn't talk about religion at work, but religion is a huge part of people's identities. It doesn't, it's a shame it's been politicized, but it doesn't have to be political, right? These are just part of people's identities. I feel for the kids and for the, in Florida, where we've got now the Don't Say Gay. The law of the land is that, that marriage equality, we have marriage equality, right? I was working with the National Center for Lesbian Rights while they were fighting for that case, in 2013. And so many of the people that I loved, benefited from that, from the Supreme Court's ruling, right, against DOMA. So, and then at that time that was highly politicized, but that's people's lived experiences, right? So we have to, I think, support folks and be willing to talk about these things. And they don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a left or right, Democrat versus Republican thing. These are people. And I love that I saw in the chat here, human rights is not political. Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So just opening up space and time, if there are others who would like to present a question to our guest co-host today. If so, feel free to raise your hand or just simply unmute yourself at this time. Okay, well, hearing, oh, go for it. Yes, no, welcome. I'll add you to the spotlight. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. So I have a question. So I do talk in a lot of diverse spaces, and one of the issues I have is being in spaces where everyone is Caucasian. So it makes it really hard for them to relate to some of the stories that I'm speaking on or telling, especially when it comes to transgender. And a lot of states now are passing laws against transgendered youth. I just saw the more recent one in Iowa, where the law is being signed, and it's just little girls, but they're all little Caucasian girls around a table, and it just looks like a representation of just white men around a table without any diverse or disability or any other sort of representation. So how do you make people empathize, with that, and how do you make them then want action for change?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do with the snippets is that we create scenarios around folks with different identities, and you're right. Yeah, a lot of spaces, especially here in Canada, if you're in certain corporate spaces, there's a lot of almost everyone's white, right? Like there's lots of places where that is the norm. And folks will say, well, I don't, and it's very easy to sort of travel in spaces where everyone looks like you. And so, you don't have to think about these other issues. But what we're trying to do with the snippets is, so in addition to sort of practicing inclusive behaviors, we're trying to expose people to folks with different identities, with different intersecting identities that they may not necessarily be out meeting in the world, to develop that empathy. Because you can, even through the scenario, you can sort of create that those sort of emotional connections. You can read a scenario and really feel like, oh my gosh, what an awful thing, right? And for a person with that identity, to understand their experiences as well. So in those, that's one of the reasons why we try to focus on different topics and cover different things to expose people to different identities that may not experience in the real world, and to develop that empathy, accelerate that experience, so that when they do see things in the news, that they can empathize with that and say, this is that they can recognize where injustice.
Mm-hmm. I so appreciate that question. It's an important question, and go ahead, Rachel. I want to give you a chance to step in here, but I appreciate that question. Thank you for asking.
I do appreciate that question a lot, and I don't want to say your name incorrectly. Is it Sehar? Am I saying it correctly?
Seher.
Seher. One of the things, to amplify what Dr. Melissa said, but one of the things that I do is I focus on the things that are similar for everybody. So everybody has a mom, has a dad, you know what I mean? So you try and connect on the things that make us human beings. And there's so many things that make us human beings before you start looking at the differences, right? So everybody has to have had a mom, so try and begin with connecting with them with stories where they understand, right? Or where we're all the same. So just those basic relationships, grandparents, familial things, to get people to begin to pull them in and to begin to see you as human, So that's one of the things that I would say. But Dr. Melissa, could you tell us a little about your podcast? I had the good fortune of being on your podcast. You have a podcast that you have, and Dr. White is going to be on it soon.
Yes. Yeah, and I'll just tell everyone that Rachel currently has the record for the most downloads. We chatted about intergenerational intelligence, but my podcast is called Just One Q, and the idea behind it is that we try to tackle, well, it's not really fair because I always ask like huge big questions, but we try to tackle one really important question, and I speak with thought leaders and experts in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space. And the goal is to leave folks with things that they can take away from the podcast and start to implement in their personal lives or in their work. So really sticking with this sort of moving towards action and practicality and being able to apply learning to their daily lives. So I've been doing it for a couple of years now. The goal is to keep them short and impactful, kind of like the snippets. So they're 15 to 20 minutes. And my whole goal is to really focus on our guest and their expertise, because I really try to search out folks who have unique perspectives, who are thinking about DEI and challenging the status quo and pushing me to continue to learn. And so that's sort of the impetus and the goal behind it. And so that the folks who are tuning in, can I'm only asking for about 15 to 20 minutes of your time, and that you know that when you leave the podcast, you're going to have something that you can take away and start to implement in your life, in your workplace.
Love that, Melissa. And the team has placed into the chat a link directly to your podcast. And so we do hope that you all will check that out and be inspired and empowered. I'm watching the time and we are almost at the top of the hour, but I do want to go back and present a question because I hear a lot from organizations, particularly individuals within organizations that want their companies to be much more intentional about deepening its commitment to DEI. And it just seems natural to start with education. So they ask questions like, how can I get my organization to fund some type of DEI learning experience? And so how can individuals charge, Melissa, with spearheading DEI initiatives within their organizations, advocate for the decision makers, those C-suite leaders to say, yes, we're going to fund DEI training? What have you seen as some best practices?
Oh man. Well, I think, I will say it, a lot of the times it's having those really powerful practitioners come in and deliver sessions on inclusive leadership, having invoking those aha moments with leaders, realizing that they actually may not have the skills to handle these, to handle certain situations. And so oftentimes I advocate starting with leadership, because they're the ones who need to buy in and to fund this. And so I think often having a great speaker come in and have those conversations with folks. I think, it's interesting. There's a lot of data out there now. People are leaving jobs where DEIB is not a priority. It's happening. Mm-hmm. They're going to jobs. Job seekers, are looking for this, and in sort of to win talent, it has to be a priority, because people have, with the pandemic, we can work wherever we want, and so those companies that are fighting this are going to lose talent. They're not going to be able to attract talent, and DIB is not just sort of, it is not just a nice to have. It's an imperative at this point. And so the folks who are kind of behind this are going to see that their talent is leaving. So, oftentimes, as you wrote there, Nika, that like making the business case is important to do that. And as we get there, we realize that, having organizations where you have inclusive culture means you're going to have folks who are more productive, who are more happy. It's going to improve your business. So not only do you want to retain, be able to attract and retain, but you want your folks to be, working to their fullest capacity and feeling successful. So there is that business case. And, people often think that like there's a huge gap between inclusive leadership and just what makes good leaders. Often they're one and the same things, being able to have difficult conversations, being empathetic, being open and being humble. All of these things that that lead to inclusive leadership make a good leader. Right. And it's practicing it's just looking at that through an equity lens. So if I'm a good leader, I need to be an inclusive leader as well. Mm-hmm. I love this. It's a muscle. Yeah, these are things that you need to practice, and they're different. They're sort of, if you're always working on your bicep, your tricep's not going to look very good. Or if you're always working on your tricep, you got to focus on your bicep as well. So I think it's an imperative. And for folks who are looking for funding, if you find the right trainer, if you find the folks who are doing the work well, it catches on. It really does, because there's almost like a freedom or something that happens when an organization sort of goes through a bit of a struggle, and then they realize like, we can talk about these things, and not only can we talk about them, but I feel confident and I feel comfortable talking about it. That's, I think, is often the fears that people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of doing the wrong thing, and they actually just don't feel confident. And so training can help folks be confident and comfortable talking about these things. And that sort of once we're able to have these conversations, once we know that it's okay, you know, we're not going to shame and blame people, we can kind of go about our business knowing that, like, this is okay, this is part of our workplace. So, you know, it almost like, I don't know, I find that often companies will just say, oh, this is so much better, I feel better now that we've done this. So I don't know if it's, you know, it's hard to make that business case for feeling better, but ultimately there's lots of stats, and I, you know, always happy to share those with around like the ROI of DEI.
Thank you so much for your response. I'm going to let Rachel have some final remarks to close us out, and then she will yield to you to give us your final thoughts that you want to leave us with, Melissa. But thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa. This has been such an enlightening hour. Thank you for sharing with us that history, activism, education, repetitive learning is very important. And we're down to the top of the hour. Could you give us your final thoughts before we head out?
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, that, and I know we've talked about this a number of times, but I really do want to say that inclusive behaviors is a skill, and it's something that can be taught and can be learned and needs to be practiced. So if you're not there, that's okay. It's important to just start, and you know, that discomfort, that the confidence comes through practice. And so that is sort of that's the message, is that these are skills that can be learned and need to be practiced. So I want to thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa. Practice makes improvement. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.